So thank you all so much, everyone, for attending our LGBTQ perspectives and understandings of foreign policy and international security workshop today. Before we begin, I would like to thank all of the students who have worked so hard to make this workshop possible. So if you could all turn on your cameras for a moment. I would like to thank David Antunes, Madeline Elliott, and Christina Renziti so much for all of the work that you are doing to make this event possible and all of the work that you are doing behind the scenes today. So thank you all so much. All right, for all of our attendees during our event today, you can contribute to the conversation through the chat function and the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Please direct all of your questions to the Q&A function and commentary to the chat function. We will have a Q&A session near the end of the event, so please continue to put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens throughout the event. We have closed captions available during today's event. However, we recognize the limitations of closed captions in Zoom, so participants can use a TTYL service by calling into the webinar, which has been enabled. And I invite all of our attendees to engage throughout the event on social media. I'm going to now include the links to all of our social media pages within the chat. Please continue to engage throughout the event using these platforms. Okay, so I now have the pleasure of introducing our incredible group of speakers before they introduce themselves. So starting with Dr. Jamie Hagen. Jamie is a lecturer and professor in international relations at Queen's University Belfast and is the founding co-director of the Center for Gender and Politics. Jamie researches the intersection of gender, security studies, queer theory, and LGBTQ inclusion in women, peace, and security practices. So thank you so much for joining us today. And next, I'm going to welcome Birgitta Olsen. Birgitta is the Director of Political Parties at the National Democratic Institute. Birgitta, I'm so sorry, at the National Democratic Institute and the former Swedish Minister for European Affairs and Democracy Issues. Between 2010 and 2014, during her time as the Swedish Minister for European Affairs and Democracy Issues, she served as a strong international voice on gender equality, democracy, and LGBTI rights. Thank you so much for joining us. And finally, I would like to thank Sahar Moazzami. Sahar is the United Nations Program Officer at Outright Action International and a New York State Bar admitted attorney with a focus on international human rights law. Sahar is an advocate for LGBTQ rights, working to support the cause through UN processes and mechanisms, acting as a strong voice on the importance of the inclusion of LGBTQ people in peace and security work. I now invite all of our panelists to introduce themselves. We are so excited to hear from this incredible group of speakers today. And I invite Jamie to introduce herself first.
So is this when you'd like me to do my 5 to 10 minutes on the gap I'm speaking to, or just say hello? My apologies for not catching that.
No worries, we are going to address that at the very end. So please just go ahead and introduce yourself. I only had a brief moment to talk about all of the incredible work that you do.
Sure. Thank you so much for organizing this. I'm really excited. I'm also thrilled to be having a second conversation similar to this with Sahar, and it's just really nice to be seeing these spaces opening up. I've been writing about this since about 2016, where I started reflecting on queering the women, peace, and security architecture, but no surprise, I wasn't actually necessarily just thinking about women, peace, and security. when reflecting on what queer interventions can mean to thinking about peace and security differently, thinking about attention to LGBTQ people in this work. And so I'm really looking forward to these fantastic questions that you've got lined up for us. I'm also so thrilled to hear from students who are very much digging into this. And so, right, and then these questions about activism, policy, and scholarship, and how do we talk across these spaces. So I have primarily published in academic spaces, but I'm always mindful of drawing on policy when making these academic contributions, and definitely don't see them as being separate spaces, though I do recognize that sometimes we have to be very intentional about finding ways to link up the work that can be quite siloed. So thank you again for organizing this workshop so we can really dig in and think across these challenges.
Thank you so much. I now invite Birgitta to go ahead and introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Alice. And just shortly, I joined the NDI, the National Democratic Institute, last year in April. But before that, I had a 20-year-long political career in my homeland of Sweden, and I'm still here in Stockholm, so I'm calling from Stockholm tonight. During all these years in politics, I could feel, and I will also show that during my presentation, that we should be positive when it comes to progress in this area, and that's what I want to highlight. But as you mentioned, for your presentation, the LGBTQI rights were always very close to my heart, both from the Swedish context, but also from the European and global context. And I had a great privilege during many of these years to work with one of Sahar's colleagues, Maria Sjödin, who was always my kind of soundboard to test new ideas and to maneuver smartly and to get progress. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always such a good sign when all of our panelists already know each other or have worked in similar spaces. And so next, I'm going to invite Sahar to introduce themselves.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alice. And I kind of just want to echo what our other panelists had said of being so happy that we're having this conversation and wanting to just put out there that this conversation is not, and these kinds of panels are not the norm yet, really. Like, these are the first of their kinds, to quite bluntly put it. So it's really, I was really excited when I saw this invitation and saw that how it was being integrated into this program. And of course, I'm so happy to be on a panel and speaking with Jamie and getting to meet Birgitta. And, you know, just a way of background, I think you gave a lovely introduction, but I work, as Alice said, I work as a UN program officer for an organization called Outright Action International, and we're based in New York, but we're a global NGO working to protect and promote the rights of LGBTI folks globally. And we have staff across the world, and I believe at this point, 6 different continents. And focusing more on the national, local, and regional and international level. But my work in particular focuses on the UN mechanisms, and very specifically the ones that are located in New York in the US, which includes the Commission on the Status of Women, the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, the UN General Assembly, but also a year-long following of the Security Council, working within the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security with 19 other organizations, but Outright serves as the only LGBTI-specific organization. So doing exactly what Jamie was saying, trying to queer all of the UN spaces, but also having that specific outlook on queering the Security Council and the work of those member states. So yeah, it's really great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you all so much. I am so excited to have such an incredible group of speakers here with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with our first panelist question. But I invite all panelists to feel free to ask each other questions as well. We want this to be a free-flowing conversation, and I'm very excited to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and direct our first question to Jamie. And then the rest of you will have an opportunity to answer as well. But incorporating queer experiences and identities into the Women, Peace, and Security agenda requires the separation of the terms women and gender. Can you elaborate on the harm in using women and gender interchangeably? And how can we better integrate masculinities and femininities into the women, peace, and security analysis when it comes to LGBTQ individuals?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And it's something that has definitely been a driving force for the work that I do. And again, this is not something that I think about it in the context of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, or some would refer to it the Gender, Peace, and Security agenda. And that's a larger conversation that I'd be interested to hear what, I mean, I'm going to do the professorial thing already and say, please tell me what you think about these two different framings. But from thinking, one of the things that I noticed as a really frustrating and problematic gap is that without being intentional about defining these two terms, really pernicious assumptions creep in, and the default of assuming cisgender and assuming heterosexual identity just fills in the gap, right? And so there's that problem in terms of just a direct representational issue of who's actually being included. But then there's also the challenge of how to think about homophobia and transphobia as a part of this work. Not that we only need to think about violences, but realistically, when we talk about the way that women, peace, and security has been taken up, a lot of it has been around attention to violences, gendered violences, and that just doesn't enter the conversation when there, in my experience, what I've seen in policy work, what I've seen in academic spaces, just in general discourse from practitioners, it just doesn't enter the conversation. So there's a missed opportunity around intersectionality. And there's also, so there's that problem in terms of the framing of how we understand what the problem is to then see what the solution is, right? But I also think that there's, you know, in talking to practitioners too, people don't necessarily recognize that they're not being welcoming to lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities, actors to feel like they can be out, they can talk about sexuality as being an important dimension of thinking about gender, peace, and security if there isn't that intentionality. So those would be the key things that I'm thinking about when I'm urging people to be really intentional about defining these two terms differently from one another. And since I know I get to have the luxury of going first on this one, I'll go ahead and pass the baton and let the other two speakers respond now.
Thank you so much. And yes, intentionality, I think, matters quite a bit here. So I'm going to invite Brigitte to go ahead and respond to some of the harms of using women and gender interchangeably in thinking about LGBTQ inclusion.
I can totally agree what Jamie mentioned before, and I think, I mean, I've always had one of my legs into the feminist movement, and then maybe the other leg very closely connected to the LGBTI movement, and sometimes I can feel that the misunderstanding is happening because lack of knowledge. Sometimes it can be related to lack of information about intersectionality, and sometimes it takes some time for some folks to understand how they need to kind of integrate these perspectives and so on. And also, on the other hand, I've seen so many times from the political side, I've seen very often kind of older politicians that suddenly did understand that we need to talk about human rights abuses and connect that to the LGBTIQ society. And then they maybe use the wrong language. I'm not talking about harassment, or so I'm just talking about the framing. And they also maybe felt isolated because they were not on the same side from the kind of academic way. So I think sometimes we need to be kind of generous from many sides to include people that want to have the real change. And also thinking about the LGBTI movement itself. I was kind of surprised when I could see that you also used the queer, the Q word. Because in the American context that I've been before, the Q is not included. In the Scandinavian context, the Q is always included, but not in the American context that I've seen. And also, for example, when I, as a young politician in the mid-90s, went to my first Congress with the Swedish LGBTIQ movement, I was a bit surprised as a feminist because all the conversations were around gay men and the situation in life for gay men. Then I went to another Congress a year later, the lesbian ladies had some more space in that conversation, but no one talked about bisexuals or transgender people. So I think also to include into the movement itself, that the movement have also been part of this kind of modernization and more intersectional approach, to have that kind of conversation part of that.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. I absolutely agree. So moving on, Sahar, if you could answer some of the harms of using women and gender interchangeably, and how that works to the exclusion of LGBTQ folks.
Of course. And, I think I get the benefit to say, ditto to everything Brigitte and Jamie said, but maybe trying to bring it a bit further and also fill the time of my speaking slot. I think, again, we need to be intentional and inclusive around our language, because like Jamie and Brigitte were saying, when we don't, those conversations are left out, and we also fall back on assumptions, right? On assumptions of what we mean when we say women. Because again, women also includes LGBTI folks, right? There are LGBTI folks that identify as women, but also are, X, Y, or Z, because that's what intersectionality is, right? We hold various identities, but we also risk, when we're using those terms interchangeably, unfortunately falling back on what's been decided upon, that what women means, and usually falling back on these inherent, this definition of women as these inherent features biologically or something like that. And we kind of lose the conversation around, when we're talking about violence and discrimination faced by individuals based on their gender, where that actually comes from. And that comes from the root causes of that violence and discrimination, which comes really from the social construction around what we assume these genders, or various genders, what role they play in society, what role they play, in relationships, and where we put them in terms of this hierarchy of life, right? How we understand women, particularly biologically, as, quite blatantly, in inferior positions. And we've seen that across time, right? So what we lose there is really losing this idea, or this essentialism around what it means to be a woman, and also the social construction around that, and the fluidity of what that is, because no two people are the same. It doesn't matter what my anatomy is, because my anatomy is not the same as your anatomy, right? Everyone is changed, and we kind of lose that distinction and the fluidity around people, lives, bodies, so on and so forth. So I think what the harm really is that we lose the ability to actually tackle the underlying issues that cause the violations, the violence, the discrimination that comes from those assumptions that we place on these words. And unfortunately, the term women has embodied really this essentialist definition of what it really is to be a woman, as defined by, folks in predominantly places of privilege, white, cis, heterosexual, some of the terms some of the ideas that Jamie was referencing to. So I think that's what the real harm is when we have that discussion.
By the way, I realized I didn't actually answer the second question. I have thoughts on that too, the second part of that question. So I could come back if that's
Please
possible.
go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, and absolutely, all of that, and thinking about masculinities and femininities specifically, I've been thinking more about the work that's been done to point out how white femininity has been mobilized in really violent ways, actually. And we see this potentially being taken up in CVE spaces. We see this countering violent extremism and terrorism. We see it creeping into peace building work. And, there's really important feminist, anti-racist work to make us very aware of the way that white feminism and white femininity in particular is mobilized against people of color, specifically Black men. And I think we need to be very careful about when that we hear talk about women and girls and femininity being something that's used in that way to sort of like create, again, this essentialized idea of women that can then be used strategically in problematic ways. I also think, of course, we have to untangle who can be masculine and who can be feminine and in what ways. Again, to this point, like, this is not about anatomy. There, you know, women obviously embody many different varieties of masculinities. Masculinity is not only toxic. And I think that when we sort of boil down the narratives to really, or like default to not having conversations about that, these complexities get lost. And I definitely have found, you know, queer and trans communities have got this conversation down, right? Like this is something that the queer and trans communities are very much invested in talking about. And so I see that as a really valuable contribution to be made to sort of link up those knowledges and thinking about femininity and masculinity in that way. It's a really good question, and I just had totally separated out the answer to a different part of my notes. So thank you for letting me come back in.
Absolutely. I recognize that it was also a long question. So I appreciate, feel free to ask me to repeat questions as well. But some themes that I see emerging is, you know, this danger in essentializing what we mean about women, and also how it's used to weaponize, how these conversations are weaponized as a tool to exclude LGBTQ folks from these conversations and in peace and security work. So my next question speaks a little bit more to that. So globally, for the past few years, we've seen this rise in right-wing authoritarianism globally. And so we've seen these actors weaponize the defaulting to white, cis, heterosexual women. And we've seen this rise in right-wing authoritarianism. And can you, I'll speak to the impact of this trend in the rise of right-wing authoritarianism on LGBTQ rights, and exactly how does right-wing authoritarianism often target LGBTQ populations? So I'm going to invite, go backwards and invite Sahar to go ahead and answer that question first.
Great, thank you so much for that question. I think that's really important. So to be quite blatant, obviously it has quite a negative impact on LGBTI communities. What we see, or what we've seen in particular contexts where we've seen right-wing authoritarianism grow and populist movements grow, is this fierce negative backlash on communities, on rights, on rhetoric, which all turns quite violent. We've seen a number of countries. What I should say is that we have seen, and let's give it like a 5-year cycle, right? What we have seen in the past 5 years is, this growing ability in some countries to, realize our rights as communities and individuals based off of, decriminalization, things like that. But we've also seen, increase in targeted violence. We've heard from government authorities themselves this violent anti-LGBTI rhetoric. And we know that rhetoric and the stance by right-wing authoritarian governments and individuals is used really to, kind of condense power. It's using, I think this speaks a little bit to a question that we'll get into later, but it's not coincidental, it's a tactic. It's an explicit tactic to be able to hold on to power, grow a body based off of these fears, really, that, if we extend rights, which is like the language, it's contracting rights for others, and those who have, came up realizing that they have been, or not realizing, I guess it's implicit a lot of the times, but when you're already from the norms, right, that are set out by society, already feeling the benefits of it, when this rhetoric is used to say, oh, if this extends, that means your benefits are going to start dwindling, that, I think that's played quite well in terms of operating in specific contexts, but not even specific. I think we can say that that's been kind of a global trend in various contexts, right? It's been able to condense that power, condense this idea that if certain and most marginalized communities grow in their ability to actualize and realize their rights, then your rights are at risk. So it speaks well to citizens who are in contexts where that is a real fear, right? So, of course, this impact, we've seen a number of contexts where there's been increase in violence, targeted murders and death of LGBTI communities. I want to say particularly to trans women of color across the globe, including in the United States and the global north. And we've also seen this trend go into legal and policy spheres. So it's not just about rhetoric anymore, it's actually putting into law specific policies that detriment the community and their ability to, live full and effective lives. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your response, Sahar. And Brigitte, I know that you've done a lot of work in the Eastern Europe and Russia context, so I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on the rise of right-wing authoritarianism and how this has impacted LGBTQ rights.
Thank you so much. As Sahar mentioned, this is a truly kind of global trend to see how right-wing populist nationalistic movements are strong. I mean, we can go to not only to the eastern and central parts of Europe, but to the Philippines with Duterte, and to what we had in the United States during Trump on transgender issues and Lgbti issues and so on. So it's a global trend that we can see in the east, in the west, in the east, in the west, and north and south. And that's something that we need to acknowledge when we have smart strategic solutions, how to kind of handle it. And I think, it is kind of obvious for most folks that minorities, immigrants, the Jewish population, the Muslim population, and other minorities fear and should fear when the right-wing populist political parties are coming into government. And that's what they're doing right now. They're leading some countries. That's a fact. That also reflects a lot on the policies. But I think here is also interesting to see kind of how they also are smart and strategic, how they maneuver when it comes to this field in politics, and that we can see differences in different parts, for example, in Europe, when it comes to LGBTI issues. I mean, all of these different political movements, they've never been straightforward in the pushing for LGBTQI rights or so. They've never been, human rights pioneers or so on, not at all. But they tend to kind of change their message depending on the context that they are in. So, for example, in the classical eastern and central parts of Europe and Russia, as you mentioned, you can see the very, very, very aggressive approach all the time on minorities, and especially in this field. But what we also seen in other parts of Western Europe is that the right-wing populist parties, for example, in the Netherlands and in some other countries, they tend to avoid to put LGBTI community in the center under aggressions, because they know that so much did actually change among the average population when it comes to liberalism and tolerance values. So that's also something to see how they kind of frame their message because of the context. They're still, as homophobic as all of them, but they just frame the message differently compared, for example, in the context of Poland and Hungary. And that's interesting to see. It's some kind of pinkwashing or so that they try to do. And then we have this new expression that you probably heard of, all of you, that is called Homo Nationalism, that has been strong in some European countries lately. Not strong, but among individuals. And here I want to acknowledge that the well-established, very serious LGBTIQ movements, they've never been part of this. But you can see individuals from the rainbow community that maybe be attracted or becoming kind of the spokesperson for these different movements connected to anti-migration scenarios and so on. So that's also something I think to reflect upon. But they are moving, and they are feeling where the average citizen in the country is right now when it comes to liberal and tolerant values. So that's something trends I think to follow.
Thank you so much for your response. Jamie, can you speak a little bit more to the rise of right-wing authoritarianism and its impact on LGBTQ folks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to see this, which I think think Sahar mentioned is this is cyclical, right? This is not something that, in some ways, this is very old and we've seen this, and the way that it's taking shape and actually able to establish roots is very similar in different places. And that's because it's about upholding patriarchy, which looks very similar in all these different contexts. Not to say that we don't need to be context specific in seeing how it unfolds and why it's able to take root. But I think actually flipping this question a bit, I am really interested in, why is it able to take hold? Why is this very tired trope of picking the deviant? And okay, so sexuality is the deviance that we're going to be picking on today. Cynthia Weber writes about this and looks at the queer asylum seeker as being this very convenient deviant person to, instill this fear in those who can look to the state for their security, right? And I think emerging feminists, again, there's decades of work on this, but this idea of like a universal idea of care as opposed to neoliberalism, which pits people against each other and is able to stoke this fear of the other coming to take away or to change what we know is the family we've always had, which is nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. It's not true. But under this insecurity and vulnerability manifested through neoliberalism, it's very powerful to look to the deviant and create, point to LGBTQ people, let alone LGBTQ asylum seekers as, the threat, right? When actually there's enough, that's not the threat. Neoliberalism has created the lack, right? It's not because LGBTQ people are coming to take something away, right? So, and we do see this, and I also think this tenuous tie of supporting LGBTQ people is also why it works, right? Like if feminist organizations or those that were committed to social justice work really did have this strong commitment to holding on to supporting LGBTQ issues as central, then it wouldn't be as easy to make transphobic bills that are all over the US right now. We wouldn't be having The Guardian continue to publish this nonsense, this transphobic nonsense, right? So I think it also speaks to the room to grow within the organizations that could really be centering those that are so obviously, that continue to be taken up as the easy deviant of the day, right? And instead like center protecting and supporting the work of those communities. So and we could talk about where different places where this is, I've written about how this took shape in Latin America in the Colombian context, but you can also just see bill after bill in the US right now against like trans athletes, trans kids, and why is this taking hold? And so in some ways it's definitely about LGBTQ people, but in other ways it's about, this idea of why is this the convenient fear, threat right now, which I think is the work that social justice and international human rights workers need to be thinking about together, right, and across communities.
Absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, I think talking about scapegoating is so important. And as well, you mentioned, Jamie, about this room to grow for many different organizations. And in thinking about that, thinking about organizations that contend that they are supporting human rights, we often hear arguments brought up about cultural relativism when we talk about LGBTQ rights, and as an excuse to not include LGBTQ folks in global South contexts. So I'm going to invite Brigitte to answer this first. Can you speak a little bit more to how cultural relativism is being used and weaponized to prevent the integration of LGBTQ rights at the international level, and this idea that LGBTQ identities are a Western construct? And how can global activists, researchers, and policymakers address this argument?
I think it's like when you fight for democracy, when you defend democracy in your world, you need to focus on the universal values. I mean, this is not European values, this is not Western values to have marriage equality or having having an equality approach or rule of law in a country. That's a rights-based approach. So I think that's very important. Never to kind of accept that discussion at all. And sometimes politicians they maybe fear and they kind of involve themselves in this discussion on cultural relativism. But I think it's important to have the universal approach, and also to acknowledge if people are raising the issue of the Western values. I mean, in some countries, for example, I mean, India, when it was a colony, I mean, it was the British that introduced some of the really homophobic laws to the country. So it's also important to see the stories from different sides. But I think to stick to universalism, that's also very key. But also another thing from the kind of political point of view, I think sometimes a mistake that quite a few politicians are doing is that they're not having enough contact with the LGBTI community in many countries that they're working on. So sometimes they maybe do statements, yes, because they want to please the home audience and the voters back home, and not listening to the people that are actually affected by decisions. And that's something I think we need to think about much more. And we have some, Sahar can elaborate on that on the UN level, but sometimes you have Western politicians from European countries that are going to introduce, for example, same-sex marriage in their home countries. And that's fantastic, that's human rights, and it should be equal. But then they maybe go to the UN, to the UNGA assembly. We have one very good example of that, and going really fierce, like they suddenly discovered that LGBTI rights are human rights. And the LGBT activists in countries that have a really tough situation, they just maybe would have wished that politician would have focused on getting rid of the death penalty or violence or something that is maybe more approachable for them for the first step, even though they should have same-sex marriage also in the future. But this is something I think we need to think about more, how to maneuver more kind of smartly. And one thing that I felt through the years that was extremely good to create new alliances for the LGBTIQ community, and that was to also tell the stories that the rainbow community is always, in most countries, the strongest defender of democracy. You have the young activists that are fighting not only for their own situation, but also freedom of expression. I mean, pride parades, that's kind of a litmus test, I think, of democracy in many countries today. So yes, to connect these things, I think that's very important.
Thank you so much. And so I'm going to follow Brigitta's lead and invite Sahar to follow up to this question of how conversations about cultural relativism, especially on international levels, is weaponized to avoid the inclusion of LGBTQ folks, or the idea that LGBTQ identities are a Western construct.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Brigitta, I think you really hit the nail on the head with your three main points. And just to speak a bit to the UN level, we hear this is the main argument that we hear when it comes from a particular group of states, but also that's basically half the UN, right, member state body, around this idea of, LGBTI is being forced upon us by Western countries. Like, even thinking about, the terminology that we use at the UN isn't really actually LGBTI. We try to speak about individuals and their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their gender expression, and sex characteristics. And this is actually bringing in that universalist approach, right? That everyone has these, right? Just some have those that are targeted because of, that thing by certain, folks who want to other individuals, speaking back to our last conversation point, to othering individuals to make sure that we're withholding and keep condensing power, right? But Brigitta was completely, on the money, basically, when she spoke about, wanting to focus on a rights-based approach. And it's talking about the realization of all rights, regardless of any of these grounds, including SOGIESC, or sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. But also that second point, Brigitta, I think it's really important to also remember the colonial history of a number of these laws. When we look at particular contexts, we have, and if you take a more extensive historical view of societies, we actually see individuals with diverse SOGI-esque within traditional narratives of communities, tribes, localities, and it's only when, you know, colonial countries started to create what are now known as our nation states and the borders that they create that came with it, did we fall into, you know, this othering based on these characteristics to, again, set up that hierarchy, right? And a number of the laws today that we see criminalize individuals based off of their sexual orientation or their real or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity and expression actually come from that colonial history. So I think it's very important to always hold that in those conversations. But then speaking to that last point, Birgitta, it's also really important to first and foremost, listen to those in those countries. You know, when we have conversations at the UN from a particular country saying, oh, there are no people that identify as LGBTI in my country or context, it really is an interesting situation when we have, you know, activists that outright works with on the ground there, you know, being able to give them that information and say, this is what your government's saying. Because, you know, LGBTI communities are resilient and they exist everywhere. And a number of, you know, we did a report at Outright that kind of tried to do a mapping of NGOs that are registered in countries, and we saw that there was an overwhelming amount of LGBTI organizations registered one way or another. I think it's important to say that legally speaking, there were a number of hurdles and obstacles from organizations to be able to register. But again, they're resilient, so they found ways. They changed the language, they use different language, but they're still working on the rights of LGBTI community members in their context. And it's really making sure that we are working to put first and foremost their experiences, their lived experiences in their context. And, you know, speaking humbly from someone who works at an international NGO, really knowing when, you know, it's not up to an international NGO to have that conversation. Really, we should be looking at local civil society organizations because they exist, they have that information, they have the experience, and they know what's best in their context. So really bringing their experiences to the forefront and taking their lead, following their lead.
Absolutely, I think, yeah, very important points, especially for both you and Brigitte, talking about that role of colonial history in shaping norms on gender and sexuality, and yeah, uplifting local activists. So Jamie, if you could also speak to the role of cultural relativism and claims of Western construction of LGBTQ identities, and how global activists and policymakers can combat or respond to these arguments.
Yeah, I absolutely. First and foremost, listening to the people who are, you know, when you hear the stories about there's no queer people here, there's no lesbians and wherever, Siberia, whatever the nonsense phrases, right? I do think it's very helpful to, you know, listen to those communities and make it, I think we need to be careful about the visibility narratives because there's all kinds of reasons that just making people visible doesn't actually lead to progress or safety. But I also think it's decolonizing thinking about sexuality. And so I think the crux is really, unfortunately, yes, there's a lack of knowledge about certain things, sure, but people have, you know, what is that feeling of feeling like, oh, am I being appropriative when I mean, if we go back to the Yogyakarta principles and these key ideas about everyone having a right to seek asylum, everyone having a right to truth, and how does this impact queer and trans communities differently? And how do we hold true to this work? And the cultural relativism, it's a deflect. It's a tactic to deflect, right? And but in some way, it's powerful and it works in a lot of ways. And I think part of that is because of people feeling ill-equipped to speak back to that, and you know, definitely being aware of the potential for, you know, not necessarily being able to translate well across spaces, but that, you know, we have transnational feminist and queer activists and mobilizations that we can learn from and learn with. And I think it's also really so much of it is the same way that it's taken up when there's the pushback against abortion access. and, oh, that's, people don't want abortions here in the same way. That's a Western liberal value. Okay, no, this is this is patriarchal violence, and that's being mobilized in this really troubling way. And so, yes, I think it does help to, of course, be, have the examples and the people who have been doing this resilient work to be in community with. But I think it's also the responsibility of those who are in the more privileged positions to refuse this and to be grounded in that refusal that this is sexism and this is patriarchal and we've seen this before. And no, next.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think we hear these arguments too often in international spaces, claiming to promote human rights. So before we open up to audience questions, we have this question. How can we bridge the gap between practitioner expertise and research that specifically targets the integration of queer and trans identities into the women, peace, and security, or the gender, peace, and security agenda globally? So I'm gonna invite Jamie to go ahead and respond to this first, bridging this gap in expertise between practitioners and academia, which I'm sure you can speak.
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, and it's something that I have to say, even in the past 6 months, there's been so much interest in taking this up from different spaces that I just haven't had the opportunity to be in conversation with. So, I definitely think there's the educational element, because I do think that people who are straight and cis kind of say, I don't feel like it's for me to talk about, in way more often than it's just very upsetting to see. But we see this happen with other intersectional issues as well. And so I do think that having the commitment to this, the long-term commitment, so that people have the experience of being in community with queer and trans organizations and are practiced in seeing this as their responsibility. I mean, that would be one thing. But I also think we're at a moment, and I'll be interested to hear what other folks think about this, of needing to establish this community of practice guided by those who would be most impacted by this intersection of taking up LGBTQ issues and women, peace, and security. And I think there's I think it will absolutely, well, I don't want to say this, we've seen this before, but I do think that having those most impacted by this work be part of establishing what needs to happen next is pretty important. And I think that right now it's not quite there yet. I think that there's the interest in the initiative, but it's not quite there yet. And so I think that this is, there's also the siloing issue between different spaces, but I think that more so what I'm seeing is this challenge of how do we have those people that this will matter most to be part of shaping how we do this work. And at least certainly on the academic side of things, and the desire to maybe have funded initiatives where we start to maybe institutionalize this in the way that, women, peace, and security has been institutionalized for 20 years, right? This is not just a challenge for this specific issue, but I do think that having the long-term commitment to have a community of practice to take this up, and not necessarily have it be tied to what can be really exclusive spaces of communities of excellence. Tony Hastrup and I have been writing about this, reproducing racial hierarchies by having these spaces that are based in Western institutions or Western NGOs that, I don't want to be a binary here, it's more complicated than that, but it can really reproduce this idea of come be the expert here, and then we'll help you do what you need to do. How do we think differently beyond that? And I think we're at, it feels like there's momentum and we're at a moment to think together about this. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Jamie, thank you so much. So nice to hear the academic perspective. Not that you speak for all academics, but the academic perspective on this, on bridging this gap. So I'm going to invite Sahar to now answer from the civil society perspective how we can gap bridge this gap rather of expertise between academia and civil society work.
Absolutely, and I think the starting point, at least from the civil society perspective, is that we do think Dr. Jamie Hagen speaks for all academics. So, so we take that point of view. But yeah, I think there are a number of methods. I think Bridging That Gap is doing exactly this, having conversations that also, transcends these kind of siloed areas that we put ourselves in, like academics, NGO, states, etc. And really, coming together to have this conversation first and foremost, and to build this, this mainstreaming throughout, right? Like if we, I think, again, as I noted in the beginning of this conversation, you don't see that many conversations that are about queering the WPS space or the PS space, right? I would love to get to a point where we are just having peace and security conversations, and LGBTI is just within there. It doesn't have to be its separate and own standalone conversation. But of course, what we're doing, what your question asks is how do we bridge that gap? And I think Bridging That Gap also takes into kind of reevaluating the way in which we approach some of this work. Like when I think about doing research in this area, 4 years ago when I started doing my work at Outright, and I started trying to build my own capacity when it came to WPS and the intersections with LGBTI communities, I found one piece of writing, and it was Jamie's, and it was excellent, but it kind of took me back, thinking like, wow, there is not that much out there besides some quick articles here and there. And I think when we think about that, a lot of the reasonings that we hear, or at least I've heard when I go to, UN discussions about sexual violence and conflict, and trying to particularly speak to the sexual violence experienced by LGBTI communities, is, oh, we couldn't find anyone to speak to this. Oh, there's just not data on this intersection. And when we take a step back from that kind of explanation, it's like, okay, but you're using traditional methods of gathering data in this field, which do not work for communities that will not out themselves because they're criminalized, will not come forward to you because you are an institution that continues to uphold patriarchal and hierarchical values and systems against them. So how are we actually flipping our methods on their heads, or actually just trying to take that time to, kind of break down what are the limitations of the way in which we do this kind of work already, and how can we be more expansive in the way that we approach it so that we're being more inclusive, and also not falling back on these tropes of, oh, these people, there's just, they don't exist in this context, or they're not working at this intersection. Because even if not working at this intersection, people are living it, and that experience and that understanding of how it affects them is important. So how are we, using disaggregated data? How are we, even when we're thinking about data accumulation, really breaking down some of these demographic questions that we use? And how are we putting in the work to actually go out and find communities that aren't, don't have the privileges or the access to automatically line up when these kind of questionnaires or surveys or things are put out there in spaces like the digital world, where, rural communities can't even access digital, or not all, but, speaking to issues around digital divides. So really trying to, I think, first and foremost, we really have to reevaluate the way in which we do this work.
Thank you so much, Sahar. And I have also spent many late nights integrating Jamie's work into my own research and reading her incredible research. So Brigitte, as another someone who has worked both on the public sector in this work and now in a civil society role, how do you think we can best bridge this gap between practitioner expertise and research on integrating LGBTQ folks into peace and security conversations?
From a political level, you need to reach the people that have the power, and that's a fact. And then you need to identify your strategies to reach the people with the power, and then that could be a variety and diverse different kind of strategies to do that. But as both Jamie and Sahar mentioned, leaving the silos, I think, is the first step for all of us to do that. When I was elected to Parliament back in 2002, we had this very lovely cross-party LGBTI group that worked on these issues. And we invited the civil society, we invited the academic scholars and others that were part of this group. And it was good because quite a few of us, we were maybe only like 3 or 4 in every single party that kind of were pushing for these ideas. So we needed each other. But what happened after some time was that people felt more identity with their own kind of ideology or the party structure than the solidarity that we would have needed to reach the people with the real power. So I think that's something to feel about and to see. But reaching out, and politicians, they need to invite academical scholars, professors from the university and the civil society more to have this kind of vivid dialogue. But also sometimes I felt that that maybe from a university context, that if the politicians are not educated enough, they might miss out on the opportunities to have this conversation. So sometimes we maybe need to lower the bar when it comes to the educational approach to kind of reach. But also on the last thing that I would like to mention, I mean, not only the university, but also mentioning the civil society organizations. I had the privilege to work with Maria Sjödin, who is Sahar's colleague at Outright Action International, like an advisor when I was in politics to discuss things. And I think we need to create more of these opportunities to have the first-hand knowledge when you're going to pass a new resolution or going to discuss things, how to move more smarter and more strategic. And I think also, just finally, on a positive note, I think we've learned a lot from the political level through the years. I mean, on a UN level, Sahar will probably go back into that one, but when we were passing resolutions or new initiatives, it was mostly a group of Western countries, European countries, that were kind of the front runners. But then we learned that we should have other people that took the leadership on these issues in other countries. And I think that's changed the paradigm a bit by letting countries like Argentina, countries in Latin America to have the leadership together with others. So I think we've been smarter also to have a concept that is much more successful, because we want to have success. That's our goal.
Thank you so much, Birgitta. All right, so now we're going to transition into audience questions. And we've had several great questions already coming in from the audience. So I want to remind folks to please go ahead and include your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. But I'll go ahead and ask this first question to our wonderful panelists. So what is the role of allies and members of the LGBTQ community in advancing these agendas? So I'm going to invite Sahar to answer this first.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've touched upon it in a number of our responses, but I would say the role of allies and LGBTI community members is really integrating these discussions in various contexts, not just in conversations between, like-minded or, already our circles and bubbles of having these conversations. Although I do love having my conversations with my circles. I think it's, really trying to deconstruct what it means when we talk about the rights of LGBTI individuals and going beyond this identity-based conversation. And I don't say that lightly, because I think there has been years and amazing work done to really get us to the point where folks are talking about LGBTI people as these transfixed identities, right? But now we've come to a point, and I think we're at that point to really go beyond these identities that we've essentialized as well, right? And really expand the way that we're looking at the underlying structures of oppression and the root causes of where this oppression comes from, which transcends particular identities or what these identities look like for particular communities. So it's really trying to take, maybe taking a step forward when we're thinking about how we have these conversations and how we also mainstream these conversations in all spaces we are in, right? Because any issue is an LGBTI issue. and LGBTI issues are all issues. So when we're talking about migration, when we're talking about housing, when we're talking about labor, we're really doing a detriment when we say, oh no, we'll talk about LGBTI in that space that says LGBTI in front of it, because we know when we're talking about the most marginalized, they exist, even breaking down that acronym itself, right? And not thinking of LGBTI as this one singular identity, but rather, multiple and intersecting identities within the community itself that face, have varying levels of privilege, but also face varying levels of oppression and violations of their rights. So really trying to deconstruct it a bit more. Let's take that next step, or continue taking that next step, because there are a number of amazing individuals doing that work and have been.
Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of conversations around in the past few decades around mainstreaming women and gender analysis, but how do we take it to that next step in integrating LGBTQ identities into all conversations at all levels? So I'm going to go ahead and invite Brigitte to speak to a little bit more about how we can, what's the role of allies in this work.
As I mentioned before, we always need to be smart and strategic and to learn from other movements. Nothing about us without us, and do no harm. To carry that kind of approach when we are working with these political issues, but also, from the kind of political angle, I learned a lot through my years in politics. Especially when I met very brave, openly LGBTQI politicians that were actually elected officials, and how I could use my privileged situation as a minister and a member of parliament to create also networks between all of us, and to hear more voices. And I especially would like to raise, the first transgender woman in the Polish parliament, and I think in all Eastern European countries, Anna Grodzka. She was a great role model for me, and we tried to create networks among us. And also Robert Biedron, who is another Polish politician, a gay man, that is one of actually Poland's most successful politicians, and that he has been paving the way for quite a few. So I think also on these alliances, it's important to not only reach out to the communities, but also try to provide platforms for people that have reached some level of power and voice, and to see what could happen here. And also the thing, that's something that when it comes to alliances, that has been a very controversial in many countries. And also sometimes in the LGBTI community, do you always need to be the positive role model and representative for these issues? And some people do not want to have that role, and some people do want to do that. But that's also, not pushing people to be forced into that one. But it's extremely powerful when people can use that role. And finally, here I want to mention Guido Westerwelle, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Germany, and happily married with his husband since years back. And he told me once, the year before he died, that the most powerful moment for him was when he was traveling to the toughest countries in the world, and everyone knew that he was an openly gay man, and some of the media did write nasty articles about him before he arrived to some countries. But he could always see him and identify through his trips so many, especially young people, that felt a lot of hope by seeing him being the Minister of Foreign Affairs in a major European country, and being open about that, raising about that issue.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. So now I'm going to invite Jamie to speak to a little bit more about the role of allies in promoting LGBTQ rights on this international level.
Yeah, I'm going to speak beyond just the international level, though, I think, because I talk about being a lesbian feminist, doing the research I do, which remarkably I still, I have grad students come up to me and be like, you're the first open queer instructor I've had present to me. And I don't think we should create this as a binary. These are in UK and US universities, so that matters. And also it matters that I did queer research, so people can see that you can do queer research. But I'm also going to do the, you know, ally versus accomplice. And sort of, I think it's also to make it sort of practical and day-to-day ways that you can sort of think about being an ally or an accomplice is, you know, because I recently was on a panel about reproductive justice, and there was a similar question. And myself and another panelist were like, sorry, I guess maybe I just got an email. Anyway, of course I did. Join a union was the thing that both of us suggested, because, you know, I'm the equality officer in our UCU branch at Queens. And if you want to get to understand what it means to seriously try to be an ally and accomplice across issues, being part of a union and seeing how those issues sort of you can mobilize or not at different times. I have learned a lot very quickly, but I think it's so there's that element, and I also think something that I'm just only beginning to get an insight into is how being part of trade unions and trade union activism is so deeply tied up with these different other forms of activism and who's targeted violently. In the same, you know, who very well may be, you know, feminist and LGBTQ activists. So there's that. But I also want to say, like, sometimes being an accomplice means like offering childcare, because that's what you can do in your privileged position, right? So I think there's the, like, yes, being, you know, imagine being like the first openly trans XYZ, you know, the first lesbian feminist to speak to the student. But there's also just sort of like creating the infrastructure so that people who work 3 jobs can maybe show up to these meetings and actually get to know more queer and trans community members, right? So I think that's why I'm kind of, if we can think at these different levels of where we can intervene, and I think that can give us a bit more hope about how we move through where we are to where we want to be.
Great, thank you so much. As a daughter of 2 very proud union members, I love that you brought in conversations around worker solidarity and larger solidarity movements. So moving on to our next audience question. Let's see. Oh, this is an interesting one. So Gen Z, research is proving that Gen Z, more and more folks are identifying as being a part of the LGBTQ community, more so than ever. And what is the role, how do you think that that will impact or is impacting this work on peace and security on an international level, and in conversations around integrating LGBTQ folks? So I'm going to go ahead and invite Sahar to answer first.
Yeah, and I think at least from my personal point of view, we're already starting to see the impact in that, you know, a number of the conversations or the requests that I have to have conversations at this intersection have been from students and have been from younger folks who identify, but also who don't identify, right? Because I think we just, you know, we are, you know, coming off of the gains from those that came before us and standing on their shoulders, we're able to, you know, continue these conversations and get a bit more nuanced and have them in various spaces, not just those that we create ourselves. So I think we definitely see the effects. I think we'll see them more and more, especially as we hear younger generations breaking down or calling for reforms around power structures and the way that we view how society and how individuals in society can interact with each other. And then inevitably also, or hopefully not inevitably, but, you know, it's going to take time to, you know, break the system. But we are going to see younger folks also getting into positions of power. And when they're in those positions of power, still holding these ideals, hopefully, you know, hopefully not by getting to that point, they've shed these kind of, you know, what people call as like these elusive or grand ideals, but hopefully, you know, keeping, you know, I'm fairly confident that, you know, we'll be able to have more of these nuanced conversations as, you know, people are taking different positions in the conversation too and throughout society. So I'm quite hopeful. I'll say cautiously optimistic as well.
Those are some great points, Sahar. I'm feeling that way as well. But Brigitte, could you speak a little bit as well about to how more folks identifying as a part of the LGBTQ community is really transforming this work on the promotion of LGBTQ rights globally?
No, I totally agree with Sahar that I think we kind of have a generational shift here with the millennials and the young generation being a bit more progressive. But I think it's also important to be cautious, because it's like democracy or gender equality. You need to win every single generation. And sometimes, I mean, like we thought that democracy would be like one for the former communist countries in Eastern and Central part of Europe. And that was not the case, as we see in Hungary and Poland and so on. So I think it's important to educate, continue to fight, to show good role models and so on, to have that fight. And also, we had this survey that was presented in Sweden kind of recently, and we could see that among young men, we could see kind of the most conservative on gender equality. So that's also something that you need to work on every single generation. But I'm on the larger picture, I'm very hopeful.
Thank you. And Jamie, what are your thoughts on more folks now than ever identifying as a part of the LGBTQ community and the role that this has on larger LGBTQ rights promotion?
Yeah, I think, so I was researching a paper and started thinking about and looking through how youth, peace, and security is engaging with LGBTQ. And I was excited to see that in the progress study from 2018, there is attention to sexual and gender minorities. This is like unheard of in women, peace, and security, like resolution through the UN documents on women, peace, and security. It's just not happening. But then if you go to, you know, I always love to share this quote from Sophia Pierre-Antoine, who was speaking on behalf of Frida Young Feminist Fund. And she said, we must change the narrative of young women as passive victims and young men as perpetrators while ignoring trans youth. Young women and trans youth are already doing incredible peace building work. So find us, support us, and fund us. This is at the UN. I'm just so thrilled about this. And, you know, I think it was 2019 that we had the first open event with member states on Beyond the Binary and UN Women being part of this. And so I think it's, yeah, I think seeing that shift has been significant. So I do think it is about having the space open to then let, and I'll be interested to see how youth, peace, and security is maybe able to mobilize in that way, because of whatever we can talk about in terms of like who feels like they can say trans youth at the UN and who doesn't. I don't know. I mean, I think there's more to be revealed in terms of who will take up that call. But still, I mean, I have to say, after so much like going through these documents and being like, where are the queers? At least seeing the commitment from in the youth, peace, and security space, I'm already seeing that start to emerge for sure.
Thank you, Jamie. And actually, our coalition works very closely with the Youth, Peace, and Security Coalition as well. So yeah, we're so excited to
Let's stay in touch about this. I want to hear more about how LGBTQ is taken up in this space. I'm so excited.
Absolutely. And we're trying to take up that mantle as well in our own work. So absolutely. All right. Thank you all so much. I'm actually going to transition to our closing remarks. So thank you all so much for an incredible discussion today. And I'm going to ask all of our speakers to provide your closing remarks, answering this final question. What is a gap that you believe really needs to be addressed in conversations, research, advocacy work, addressing LGBTQ rights globally? And as we've mentioned previously, these workshops are really going to fuel the next steps in our research work as the DC Student Consortium. We're going to use these conversations to fuel our own work. So what are some gaps that we can fill or that other practitioners and students that needs to be filled. So I'm gonna open with Jamie, or invite Jamie to provide her concluding remarks answering that question.
Yay, I get to go first. So some of this will be a repetition of some of the points I've already made, but really I'm talking about the lack of paying attention to sexual orientation and gender identity in women, peace, and security, right? So there is this robust scholarship on gender, peace, and security now, but where are the bisexual, lesbian, transgender women in this, even though we know that they've been there, are there, right? So I do emphasize, as Sahar as well, and that everyone has a sexual orientation and gender identity. This is not something that should only be thought of in the context of LGBTQ individuals. And this is also about recognizing that this is about sexuality, right? This is also about sexuality. And so curiously, despite this long history of engagement between anti-war activism and lesbian and gay organizing, really, really powerful, intertwined mobilizing, there's still this lack of attention, and to trans organizing being a space where surviving and finding freedom outside of violent patriarchal systems, which, as I understand gender, peace, and security, that's exactly what we're trying to do here. Trans communities are doing it. I don't want to put this on the progress narrative as like all good, but they have been finding ways and have insights into this that are very valuable, right? And also thinking about how race, sexuality, and gender are always entangled. And so I see this, as I mentioned earlier, when talking about femininity, it's really important to keep that complexity and talking about these issues, and to sort of see when the exclusion is intentional or whether or not it's this lack of data, or this argument about we can't ask. Well, who's saying that you can't ask? And I think I'm always wary of when cisgender straight people tell you that you cannot do queer work. Always see that as a red flag, I would argue, right? And as we're talking about anti-gender backlash, this is something that we see. These are not separate projects, right? These are not separate projects looking at LGBTQ issues and thinking about gender, peace, and security, right? But moving beyond thinking about identity, if you're thinking about queer as an approach and thinking about how does bringing queer thinking into peace and conflict research and responding to violence against LGBTQ people, or really just gendered violence, how does this help us challenge what's considered neutral and what's considered natural? And that's really where I see a queering as being really helpful. But also, I think holding on to this question of who can call the cops and should we? This is something I'm keeping in mind a lot now. And how does that inform what I think about differently when I think about security work? And so queer thinking also helps us think through this binary of times of conflict and times of peace, recognizing that for those who are most marginal, this is not necessarily going to be a timeline that tracks in the same way, right? So this idea that whether or not LGBTQ people have been the ones speaking at the UN on, women, peace, and security, this is very much relevant to queer communities. And as I said, this is a responsibility for everyone. But I found this, this in Rebecca Solnit's like Hope in the Dark. We're in a freaking pandemic. I think this is actually the first time we've said this today. This is like ridiculous. This is a very hard, challenging, impossible time, right? So, she has this quote: there is far more to politics than the mainstream of elections and governments, more in the margins where hope is most at home. And I'm absolutely most at home in the margins. I'm absolutely most at home in finding this, thinking about how we can think differently by bringing the margin into the center. And I think queering really helps us do that, right? So, just as we said, not all women are heterosexual. It remains to be quite powerful to continually say this when we're thinking about women, peace, and security. So this is also part of that, like thinking about sexual orientation and gender identity as part of women, peace, and security. But I'm also thinking more about drawing on harm reduction as another strategy of how we think about security work, and LGBTQ inclusion in a space that may be asking people to work with a racist state, militarized police forces. This is real. So how do we think both and? How do we think about who may be able to be part of this initiative and who might not? And, learning from Black, queer, and trans feminist projects. In New York, there's the Safe Outside the System initiative with Audre Lorde Project. And, certainly we've been hearing a lot around the world about different ways that Black Lives Matter has been taken up, but also about initiatives like the Jane Collective, providing abortions in the US, Alliance for Choice, filling this gap where you can't rely on the state. And this is gendered violence that's being responded to underground and outside the state, right? And then I'm looking at this idea of making the road by dreaming with other queer feminists, people of color who've really been teaching me and helping me sort of stay with this complexity. So Audre Lorde, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and Tourmaline, Adrienne Marie Brown. And I think we really do have to, if we're going to be doing this for a lifetime, we do actually have to think about pleasure activism as part of this, which does not, it's so much focus on violence. It's so much focus on right? So learning to make justice and liberation that is drawn into this pleasure activism. So making it a pleasurable experience, right? Which is why, to me, this work is very much informed by lesbian and feminist art and community. How would I possibly be doing this if it wasn't? I wouldn't be able to stay and keep doing this if it weren't for that being grounded in that work and thinking about peace building and transformative justice. And being with and for and accountable to queer community. So this is something that, it is definitely challenging in these times, but I do think that spaces like this really help me to think through what we can do in weaving these different threads together. So yeah, thank you again for this event. And I look forward to, where you go in the future with these conversations.
Thank you so much. Gosh, if there was only time, there was so much I could dig into in your closing remarks, and that your quote about hope was so lovely in a time when we're all searching for a little bit of hope. So thank you. Brigitte, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and provide your closing remarks, thinking about the gap that we can fill in the promotion of LGBTQ rights that we should be looking towards.
And also to be a bit hopeful and positive as Jamie, I think it's sometimes we can see the forest for the trees, and I think sometimes, and not sometimes, always, we need to remind ourselves of all the kind of the successes that we've had so far, because time is on our side. Never forget that time is on our side. And when I was born in 1975, homosexuality was still considered to be a disease in my country of Sweden, and we're one of the most kind of liberal countries in the world today. I remember when I was 10, back in 1985, I was watching the TV with my parents, and the Archbishop in Sweden, he advised homosexuals to stay in the closet. And now the Church of Sweden is one of the most open-minded churches in the world that promotes LGBTQI rights every single day. When I was 20, a gay couple did still not have the same legal right to inherit each other. And when I was 30, hate speech against LGBTI people was still legal in my country. So I think to really reflect upon what we've achieved so far and all the fights that we have ahead of us, I think that's important to do that. And also, the conversation around these issues from a political level, I could hear when I was a young politician that I was so obsessed about sexuality when I was pushing for equal rights, or when I was pushing for adoption or insemination or same-sex marriage. It was all about sexuality. And now no one would mention that in a conversation. It would be all about 100% human rights today. And that's also, I think, a big success to think about. And just some final thing from my end here, to just highlight and emphasize again that always listen to the local activists, what kind of support that they need, because you might have a very progressive audience back home in your constituency, no matter where you are in the world, or you have a very conservative constituency, but look and ask the people that you are working together with and not working for, together with, what kind of support and help that we can provide for each other, and also learn from others' experience and mistakes. That has been something that we've not been doing as much as we should have. But the test of courage itself, it comes when we're in the minority, and the test of respect and tolerance, it comes when we're in the majority. So also think about this, and remember, no government has the right to tell the citizens whom to love, or which identity to choose, or what dreams and hopes that we should carry. That's something that we should define ourselves and be proud of.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. It's so nice to end an event on notes of hope for the future. So I'm going to go ahead and invite Sahar to provide their closing remarks in thinking about this gap that we could address in conversations, research, and advocacy work on promoting LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, thank you again. And it really has just been such a really great conversation. I hope when people are watching this recording, or folks that are on right now listening, that they've really gotten a lot out of this. I know I have. I want to thank the organizers again for creating such a helpful space with such brilliant speakers. So when I think about the gap, I guess, again, echoing everything that Brigitte and Jamie mentioned in their remarks, but I guess I just want to focus on two things, and about trying to take, I think we've had this conversation throughout our, this panel, of taking things a step further, because we're kind of in an interesting position where that's an opening, and that should very much be our aim, right? So when we're talking about, I guess, coming from my perspective of working a lot, doing advocacy with states, but also NGOs and UN bodies, what do we mean when we say things like intersectionality? I know a lot of the times when we're talking with states, it's very much of, oh, we'll add this listing that includes sexual orientation and gender identity, expression, sex characteristics, and then other marginalized communities, which, in my opinion, it misses exactly what we're meaning when we say intersectionality. And we've said that in this conversation too. How are we not just creating another silo around what LGBTI experiences in conflict are? Because within that community, the experiences of a cisgender lesbian woman is completely different from a, trans woman of color in a different context, with a disability, or, bringing in various contexts and realities. So when we're talking about intersectionality, how are we extending that conversation around LGBTI and not continuing, it's easy for us to use the acronym, right? LGBTI, but we should never actually mean that there is an LGBTI person, because that's just inherently untrue, right? There is not one person in the community that is the same as another person. So how are we really breaking that down in these conversations, and in the research that we do, in the questions that we ask, and in what we push states or other people in positions, or representatives in positions of power, to really push for when they're having these conversations in these spaces. And then the second part that, Jamie, you touched upon it, and I think is so important, is that, reality speaking, and we had that question around the rise in right-wing authoritarianism, and quite blatantly fascism in a number of contexts and countries, is that for community members in marginalized communities, conflict isn't defined how we traditionally think of it. They're not war zones anymore with, states v states or internal conflicts. It's everyday experiences of anti-democratic pushback against community members. So when we're talking about conflict, how are we actually extending that idea? It's not about, militarized war anymore. It's coming into the streets and being put against all of these policies and these restrictions on our ability to be, really. So I would put out the call to expand our thinking when we're talking about peace and security, times of peace and times of conflict. Whereas, for some, it's continuous and it's year round. And how are we really extending the conversation to capture what we're experiencing, and what we will. Unfortunately, what history shows us is we'll have that cyclical nature of what will continuously happen, and also continuously happen for communities that have always been othered. including LGBTI folks.
Thank you so much, Sahar. And thank you to all of our panelists. This was an incredible discussion today. If only we had another 2 hours to dig into everything that you mentioned during your closing remarks. But I want to thank you, Sahar, Jamie, Brigadetta, for all of your wonderful responses and your willingness to participate today. So thank you so much. And I encourage all of our attendees to please go ahead and follow us on social media to follow upcoming research and events that we're all engaging in. But thank you all so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you.